different things to auction off, not just actual physical items, but services. I'm trying to remember what they. Then we have like free golfing with George, and then and then isn't there like a parking spot too? Don't we give like premium parking for a month or something? Anyway,
free trumpet lesson. Anybody want to take a trumpet?
Hey, do it.
more details here, and actually they're going to go up to Oregon and be able to interact some with one of our former residents, Britt
Carlson.
who is now on staff. I forgot the name.
Here, right here, Henry, on the board, right there. She's
Yeah, she's the lone wolf out here up in the northwest.
But that's home for her. That's yes.
Anyway, so I will pass this around so you all can look at that. There'll be more details about that to come on the youth supper or youth luncheon coming up to raise money for their upcoming trip. So, it's good to be back. Welcome to Floyd's. You all been here before, I believe. So good to see you all again. There's a lot of announcements. I'm just going to do a few and then chime in if I've left out something significant or that you think is significant. Voter registration ends today, and if you're not registered to vote, you can do it here down in the South Atrium. So please take advantage of that, or if you know somebody that needs to take advantage of that, direct them that way. Also, they have a note in here that I thought would be helpful, and it's something I've just recently discovered. If you give regularly to the church, you can do it online, and you can also set it up for automatic withdrawals, which actually is the most efficient way to do it. If you do automatic withdrawals through your credit card, it ends up charging like a 2% fee. So you can do it through your credit card or directly out of your bank account. But either way, if you want to set up for automatic withdrawals, they're encouraging people to start with that again for this year. And also not today, well today is the Super Bowl carrying, which is starting in...
Starts at 11. Carrie is from our class is down helping set up, and she wanted to make sure that got announced. So
Okay, right, yeah, so Super Bowl carrying is today, starts at 11, goes till 1 o'clock, 1:30. And it's part of our... it used to be for the World Hunger Offering, but now it's for we're calling it the Phil Strickland World Hunger Offering to raise money for that. The lunch is free, but if donations are encouraged, they ask that you donate an amount that you might expect to pay at a nice restaurant in Dallas. And this is an annual event we do oh, that's redundant. An annual event we do every year, every February on Super Bowl Sunday. And this year we have something different. We have a guest. His name is Peter Wanda. Did I get his last name right? Kamanda, who is on staff. I can't remember if he's the senior pastor or not at the African. Help me with the name. African Inland. I wrote this down. African Inland Church of Tanzania, one of our newest mission partners. He will be at the Super Bowl carrying. He will also be officiating communion today with Heather Mustang. So for those of you who have not gone to the service yet, you will get to see him there, where they will do the Lord's Prayer in both English and, I didn't catch what his native language was.
Tanzania.
It's a good guess.
Throw it out there.
Swahili, okay.
That works too. We go with that.
And Henry, this Super Bowl carrying. This is the Phil Strickland,
Yes.
fund that Carolyn's late husband in our class. That,
Yes, Carolyn Strickland's late husband has now been named in his honor. And I was also going to mention the February affinity groups. Those start up next Sunday. Page 10 of they're calling it the tapestry again, which is really what it is. On page 10 of the worship folder / tapestry, you can get a list of the different subjects that will come up at the affinity groups. I kind of like the title of the last couple ones. One is Help, I Didn't Grow Up a Baptist or a Christian. And the other one was Help, I Grew Up a Southern Baptist. I introduce myself to people as a recovering Southern Baptist. Any other announcements? Anything I've overlooked? All right. Well, prayer requests will be written down here. Dennis will lead us in prayer. I'm going to have to leave a little bit earlier, but we will start this. Please feel free to write them down. We'll have them at the end of the lesson. We are happy to have Terry Wade back, teaching on Abraham, various subjects on Abraham. Always glad to have Terry. She's also my parents' travel buddy. So it's always good to see her, and I feel a personal connection there. Anyway, welcome back.
Thank you. I don't know who wrote this. It's so neat, and I just admire it so much. That
This
will
must
not
be
happen
Laura.
here.
Yeah, school teacher.
If I can even spell it.
Good morning.
I just thought Dennis wrote that. It's Laura.
Yeah, not my handwriting.
Not all teachers have good hands.
No, and I have to tell you, I didn't even finish words when I was teaching. I got enough of and I am not, one of the best things that I've ever heard at a conference was about a third of us are natural spellers, a third of us learn the word, learn all the rules, and we do pretty well, and there are a third of us who don't really care. Guess which group I'm in. You know, it's like some people see, you say cat, they see the cat and they see C-A-T. Some people, you say cat and they figure out, yeah, C sounds like K, so it must be a C. And for people like me, I just see the cat, okay? But anyway, here we go.
Kate.
Okay. Epiphany, theophany, paradigm, and paradigm shift. Those words familiar to you?
Second one's not so much.
Yeah.
The second one, not so much. A lot of you who've been in business a long time probably are familiar, because we went through a whole thing back in the 80s, 90s about open up your paradigms. Let something in. And basically your paradigm is your big box of beliefs, and that box has a whole bunch of other little boxes in it. And we have a real hard time letting in new information. But when we do, there's a paradigm shift. And for Abraham, God said, leave Haran and go someplace else. And it was a big shift for him. And all that followed, a total revolution in the way he thought about things. We've had epiphanies. We have the Christian epiphany, the arrival of the Magi. Now, I don't know how many of you grew up Baptist. I never heard the word epiphany during the Christmas season. I had no clue what it was about. I heard epiphany in terms of, that sudden realization of something. You're understanding something that you never understood before that changes. And again, it goes into that paradigm stuff. But a theophany is when you hear or see God. And that's what we have in this lesson today, and what we have throughout the Old Testament, we have a lot of people hearing and seeing God. And we still have that today, but that's what the theophany is. So we're going to kind of talk about all of that seeing and hearing today with Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. Just before we get started, anyone like to share a personal epiphany that you had once upon a time? It doesn't have to be a Christian one necessarily, although I'm sure we've all had those. Well, let me share one. I figured out as a teacher, if I didn't want to have discipline problems, then I should not use sarcasm with students. Because I want to tell you something. There's one of you, and when I taught, 35 of them, and they're going to get you. You know, there's going to be payback, but you're not going to know how and when, but there will be payback. And I didn't like sarcasm, but that was just a little, don't use sarcasm, because that doesn't work. So that's just kind of a personal one. From a Christian standpoint, there was that moment when I realized, hey, it's all about Jesus. If it doesn't fit Jesus, then I don't have to worry too much about it, you know, because we get so tied up in theology and doctrine, and we get so bogged down in all of that, that we sometimes lose sight of Jesus as Christians, you know, that he's the one we have to focus on. Anybody? Now that I've shared, you see what I'm getting at?
I have one. In fact, very recently, since I joined this class, I used to be skeptical about the Old Testament because I grew up in China, come here, grew up in the Asian church. All the talking over the years is about New Testament. Old Testament hard to mention. And obviously somehow I become not really overly concerned about Old Testament. What part they play in my life. Not until recently, until I joined class.
Right.
And I started learning that the story of God go back many, many more years than I have really experienced.
Okay, that's great.
So picking up on what he said, I think just Southern Baptists kind of forgot about the Old Testament, at least every church I was a member of did, and then all of a sudden it's, become relevant again. But years ago here at Wilshire, we had a guy come over, and he was Jewish, converted Jewish. And he told us all about, and it was time for a Lord's Supper.
Was that Howard Cohen?
No,
Okay.
I don't think so. But anyway, we were getting ready for the Lord's Supper to come up, and so he came and described what the Jews did in the Old Testament about bringing the gifts, and it shed so much light on why we do the Lord's Supper, why we do it, and why we do it, that I thought, well, maybe there's something in that Old Testament after all.
Well, yeah,
And then since then, we've kind of started using the Old Testament.
it's almost like the Old Testament. God kept trying and trying and trying to get his message across. And it wasn't quite working, so he finally had to give us Jesus. And when we look back at the Old Testament, we really have to look at it in terms of Jesus and pull out the Jesus messages that are there. Because it's so easy to look at the Old Testament and get pulled off and think it's about rules.
Yeah.
Good word, thank you. So as we deal with the theophanies that our characters are going to have today, we really have to look at the basic, which is God with Abraham said that he wanted to build a nation that would be a blessing to others. And we sometimes lose that when we're looking at the Old Testament. You know, what is God trying to create here? And with Abraham, he's very clear that he wants these people to be blessings to others. Now, a good title for today's lesson might be, How Deep Is My Trust in God? Because that is the question that Sarah, Hagar, and Abraham all had to answer today. How prepared am I to do what, to trust God to do what He says He will do? And let me suggest that, again, if we're not clear on that, we look at what Jesus said and taught us to say in the model prayer, Thy will be done. You know, do these people trust God to carry out His plan, so to speak? Oftentimes when we focus on the Old Testament, we look at the human characters, but God is really the central character in the Old Testament. And He speaks to these flawed human beings, and He's trying to move them in the direction that He wants to go, and that's certainly true today. Little backstory. Chapter 16 has Sarah deciding to give God a little help and give Hagar to Abraham so that there will be a child. And then Hagar runs away in the desert, and because Sarah is, and once Hagar is pregnant, Sarah has second thoughts about this. Wait, what have I done? Let's get, and Hagar runs away. But God says, Hagar, go back. When we know the rest of the story, it's kind of like, why did He tell her to go back, But that's what and she obeys. She goes back. And then chapter 17 establishes the covenant. And Abram becomes Abraham, Sarai becomes Sarah. God promises a son by the next year. Abraham kind of laughs at this idea. So God tells him to name the son Isaac, which means laughter. And then Abraham mentions Ishmael. You get the feeling through this when you read these scriptures, Abraham loves Ishmael. And God promises that Ishmael will also be the source of many descendants. And at this point, Abraham is 99. And then we get into today's scripture. So if y'all want to turn to chapter 18, 1 through 16. It's almost like, okay, Abraham, I've told you this, but I'm going to come back and tell you again. So here are Abraham and Sarah. They're in their tent. And legend, I'm going to kind of summarize the first 8 verses. And legend has it that this tent is open on all 4 sides so that they can see anybody coming. And Abraham looks out and he sees these 3 guys coming. And he goes out and he says, please stop, honor me by being here. And he's very solicitous with these 3 men. I mean, he puts on a meal that we'd all love to show up for. And Sarah is in the tent. She's helping get the meal prepared and everything. And the Hebrew commentary makes the point that hospitality is extremely important to God. In fact, it says that hospitality to wayfarers, to strangers, is greater than welcoming God Himself. When we turn our attention from God to tend to the needs of people, we do God's will. According to the Hebrew commentary, God is not pleased when we place such a great focus on Him that we ignore needy human beings. Is this not a lesson for today, World Hunger, Super Bowl day? So that this really points this out in this passage. But then the focal passage begins with 9. Shall we read? Would you like to start with 9?
18:9.
Read a couple of verses.
Okay. They said to him, where is your wife Sarah? And he said, there in the tent. Then one said, I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. You keep going?
No,
So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, I'm not old, and my husband is old. Should I have pleasure? The Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I'm old? Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son. Keep on going, finish. But Sarah denied, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. He said, oh yes, you did laugh.
yes. Yeah. You know, Walter Brueggemann writes that God's promise of a son is really beyond their ability to receive. But he makes the point that God's promise never comes in human terms. It comes in unexpected ways. And the kind of trust they're being asked, because obviously they're well past childbearing. It doesn't fit the normal scheme of life. And he says that verse 14 is the faith question, the trust question. Now, this translation says, is anything too wonderful for you? The NIV says, is anything impossible for the Lord? But so how do you see with those two different translations, too wonderful and impossible? Are they sort of the same thing?
Sort of.
If
One of them only focuses on the positive sides
okay,
of possible.
and the other one is sort of more, the impossible is sort of the negative, but the bottom line is, however you say it, it is something beyond their ability. And Brueggemann says that the answer is not one that can be given lightly. To say yes is to fully entrust themselves to God and to no other. To let the initiative leave their hands, and we could say our hands. To trust God completely is to give up control, in a sense, which is not easy to do. It breaks the paradigms of how we look at everything. But I love what he said. Sarah and Isaac do not have to accept that Isaac will be born for God to do what he has promised. Make them the parents of a nation that will bless other nations. And Bergman says it may not happen in the context of ready faith. It may happen in the context of fearful, resistant laughter. And this passage ends with them still doubting. Ultimately, another way to ask this question, is God God? More specifically, for Christians, is God who Jesus taught him to be? This is sort of the ultimate faith question that pushes us to examine how deep our faith and trust is. Is anything too wonderful? Is anything impossible for the Lord? So how would you go about answering that? What is your reaction to that?
There you go. Sorry. I'm joking.
Yeah,
But it's easier said than done, right?
far easier said than done. And the thing about it is, it's how do we say no, and that is the answer, you know. But
Terry, when the
Is our-
answer, when the answer doesn't seem to come in our time, you know, that's when, I mean, that's just what Sarah, you know, did, but I can't believe, still, I'm back to the, you know, in the few lessons ahead, when they're 350, 400 years in Egypt and praying to God to release them, and it hadn't happened, I guarantee I would have given up.
yeah, because it comes back to our time instead of God's time. It's whether or not we accept that He knows what He's doing. You know, we begin to want to question, does God really know what's going on here? You know, and
That's where your faith comes in.
yeah,
But I also think, I mean, he had an angel come and say he was gonna have this kid, right? But like in our day, I mean, we don't get things that clearly. So a lot of times my struggle is this God or is this me? And it's that I doubt my hearing or understanding of what he's saying
Or you
more
put
than I
words in
doubt
God's
him.
mouth.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
yeah.
Some of that's my struggle a lot. It's like, okay, is this right? You know, because am I getting the voices mixed up?
We
Yeah.
get bombarded with advertising with so much about us.
Yeah.
We can have it all now.
Well,
and it
and-
influences your
And we
faith.
also get bombarded by the religious voices that tell us what we're supposed to when we have a personal God that leads us. And you know, what is the criteria for that? Who is the criteria? It's Jesus. You know, so that we have that advantage of having, you know, does this fit in the context of what Jesus taught us that God wants?
You know, talking about Jesus, and I never stopped thinking about it. How many times have we studied the big fish and Jonah in the belly of the, we always say, well, I guess it's a big fish, we're not sure, whatever. And some guy I heard, and he was talking about that, and he said, you know, Jesus said later on that happened. In other words, he justified, you know, that's just a myth, you know, that really wasn't a miracle, that really never did happen. But Jesus referred to that happening and said Jonah was in that whale's stomach 3 days. And that pretty much, if Jesus referred to it, said it wasn't a myth, it was a real miracle. And then if so, then why are not these other miracles and not myths? And I think a lot of times, kind of picking up on what she said, I think, you know, yeah, there miracles still happen. They happen to you and you and you, but not to me. Oh, ye of little faith, maybe. But
Well, and I think what we have to do is we have to look in the context of how we respond, I think is what you're saying. And that we have to be careful that we don't place too much emphasis on, there is so much symbolism and archetypes in the Bible, not to mention in the biblical, well, the archetypes, just what we have that tells us that inside of us, somehow, we have acquired understandings that sometimes we don't even understand. Does that make sense? And I'll give you a silly example. How many of you are familiar with the song Margaritaville? If you know very much about archetypes, Christian archetypes, that song is full of Christian archetypes. From the people on the beach being anointed to him cutting his heel on his way back home. So, you just, you know, I won't, but what I'm saying is, back to what you were saying, is we don't tend to trust ourselves because you talk about the culture bombarding us, but we also have within the church sometimes voices that are wanting us to focus on this instead of on the larger plan, to trust Jesus to be who he said he was, trust Jesus to that God is who Jesus showed him to be.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I have trouble putting my head around the idea of God's time and our time quite a bit. I mean, I kind of believe it when we're in a group like this, but in daily life, I find how to fit our time into God's time, but how that relates. And I don't know if that's a matter of faith or understanding more or learning more from the Bible, but I find a struggle with that.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Am I making any sense?
I think so.
You're trying to incorporate our time
Yeah.
into God's time,
Yeah,
is that correct?
yeah, then I have a hard time understanding that. We can say that and say, okay, it's gonna happen on God's time. But like you said, if you're, you know.
It's
if
not
you-
happening.
Yeah, right, okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
$399.
But that's exactly what Abraham and Sarah are dealing with here, you know. And then the direction it goes is that they are living to see the promise. And you know, I guess our thing is, you know, I think it's, and I don't know, help me out here. I think what happens is we sometimes pick a situation and we want that resolved instead of, in a sense, going with the flow and living the way we think God wants us to live, to be a blessing to others. That we get bogged down in other elements, and instead of keeping our focus on what we are called to be as followers of God. And so what we have here then in this passage is nothing is impossible for the Lord if it's in His plan. But that is a big if for most of us.
Yeah.
Because we got plans. You know?
Oh,
So
okay.
Terry, the way I've dealt, because I struggle with that too, right? So the way I've dealt with it is I'm enjoying the journey, not the destination, right? These are things that I tell myself.
Right.
Because I'm like, okay, it's not happening, and so I'm enjoying the journey, not the destination. And I just wake up every morning and do it again and again and again and again. And then little by little I start seeing the fruits.
See, I teach that way, but I have.
And then
a
I
hard
forget
time
it,
living that
and
way.
Mike reminds me of it.
Yeah.
We as humans are very parameter driven.
Yes.
In other words, we like to have everything in its own little cubicle, its own little box, and this is how it lives, and everything's fine like that. Now, we look at God, and we try to do that with Him.
Mhm.
Oh, that's not gonna work.
And you've already gotten to part of my lesson later on. You know, it goes back to that paradigm thing. It's real hard to hear God speak or to lead us, even with the model of Jesus, when we've already got our box. And we really don't want anyone messing with our box, you know. So as we move through this and we keep in mind this idea of is anything too wonderful for the Lord or too impossible?
And that's where your paradigm shift should come in.
Yes, exactly.
Because when that happens, then you're flexible enough
Uh-huh.
to know what's happening and to accept it as such, or deny it if you want.
Yeah. And so we move on to the next passage, and I thought that I would just, because we really want to get to the third part of this, because that's the tough one. This next passage is Genesis 21, 1 through 21. And this is where Isaac is born. And they are happy, and there is laughter. This is the third time in this particular group of verses where laughter is mentioned. And we all know that 3 is a big number. So we have this. And when Isaac is about 2 or 3, when he's being weaned, they have a big celebration. And everybody's happy, except Sarah. Different versions. Some of the translations say Sarah saw Isaac playing. Some say Sarah saw Isaac playing with Isaac. Saw Ishmael playing with Isaac. And some say that she saw Ishmael mocking. So we're not sure what's going on here. All we know is, at this moment in time, Sarah says, Ishmael's gotta go. She can't deal with Ishmael being there. And so Abraham is torn. He loves Ishmael. But he hears God saying, do whatever Sarah wants. And he reiterates his promise that Ishmael will be okay. So she ends up in the desert, and it's bad news. She literally puts Ishmael under a tree because she can't face seeing him die. Now, he's probably 10 or 12, 13 years old by this time. And she goes off by herself. And God hears Ishmael groaning in his sleep. And he speaks to Hagar and tells her not to be afraid, that he's going to make a great nation from Ishmael. And she says, God opens her eyes and she sees the water, the well. And so, of course, we all know water is a symbol of life. And so this story ends with Hagar moving on with her promise from God that Ishmael will be okay. And verse 20 says, God was with the boy as he grew up. So this passage makes it pretty clear that we're all God's children, that God cares about the other. Who created this problem? Sarah. Sarah decided to micromanage, is what you said earlier. We don't know what Sarah's plan was. Maybe she thought she would raise Ishmael, that somehow Hagar, but Hagar is a far stronger woman than Sarah was anticipating, I guess. And we don't know. But she can't live with what she has done in terms of creating this situation. And Brueggemann says what we have here between Ishmael and Isaac is the difference between a child that was planned and a child that was a gift. The elected and the treasured. Ishmael is the result of determination. It also kind of references Jesus' story of the prodigal son. The older son was doing everything right and he had expectations, but the younger son came to understand that life was a gift, that what the father had done for him was a gift. So perhaps one way to look at this is what you referenced, is our tendency to want to get all of our ducks lined up in a row and we check off everything. And we sort of miss the epiphanies and the theophanies because we handicap ourselves in our capacity to see and hear God because we already have all the answers. We've already decided this is the way it is. Another part of the problem is I venture to say, especially our age group, we grew up in a time when a lot of education was fill in the blank answers. We are programmed for right and wrong answers. And the great Baptist ethicist, oh, that's a hard word, T.B. Maston often made the point that God's way is both and. It's not either or. God's way is not an either or way, it's a both and way. So that, and that's certainly what we have here with Isaac and Ishmael. And that God is going to use both for his plan, whether or not we understand. But we do live, we have to be careful about this either or world we get into. Because, that's not, if we look at the Old Testament, if we look at Jesus, that's not the way they did things. They didn't pick and choose they used, you know, especially the Old Testament, some of the people God uses are just, you know, whoa. Yeah, those people weren't in my Sunday school class. You know, but we just don't have
Thanks
the
be to God.
On the other hand, some of them were probably more equipped to do God's will than some of the people who were in my Sunday school class.
Terry, I'm amazed with the juxtaposition of the hospitality in the first verses we read in 18, and then the putting out, that you're hospitable to a stranger, but to someone you know, you put aside, you put away. And that's kind of how we live, I think. I mean, we can always welcome in someone else, but it's harder for us to, sometimes when we have a grievance against someone we know very well, that's the harder one.
Or even
Yes.
family.
Family, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. And it's a case of us trying here to, I guess, be more open to people, maybe, and to trust that God is working through people, and although we may not understand it. Now, we come to probably one of the most disturbing stories in the Bible. Genesis 22, 1 through 18. That's the sacrifice, the almost sacrifice of Isaac. According to one scholar, this story pretty much is open to interpretation. And in fact, there was more than one. Probably one of the points of information that makes this story perhaps more understandable is that child sacrifice, human sacrifice, was common. And that this story is here to say God does not want human sacrifice. If you remember the passage in Micah 6:8, it starts out, before we get to 8, it starts out with, "What, oh man, what does God require of you?" And they go through some things, and in verse 7, it says, "Offering the firstborn." And of course, what Micah is saying, God does not, He doesn't even want your burnt sacrifices, let alone the human sacrifices. So there's some speculation that's part of why this story is here, is to let us know that God does not want us sacrificing other people. And I would venture to say, we're not talking about killing people, but how often have people sacrificed other people for job promotions, for this, that, or the other, you know. So anyway, and of course for Christians, there are parallels with Jesus here, where it's 3 days to the place. Isaac is going to carry the wood for the altar, and going to the mountain. So this really speaks again to these elements of the archetypes and the symbolism that we find through all of the Bible and other literature. So let's read 22. Why don't we read a couple of verses apiece, starting with 1. We'll just read through the scripture here.
After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham," and he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you."
So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set out, and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him.
On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you."
Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the wood. So the two of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father Abraham, "Father," and he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for burnt offering?"
Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the two of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. I wonder what was running through Isaac's mind about this time.
Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am."
He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son.
So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided."
The angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this and not withheld your son, your only son."
I will indeed bless you, and I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of their enemies, and by your offspring shall all the nations of the earth gain blessing for themselves, because you obeyed my voice.
So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived in Beersheba.
Okay. How would you describe Abraham?
Obedient.
Obedient.
Dutiful.
Dutiful. Calm. Calm.
Faithful.
Faithful.
I think he was
Sounds
hopeful.
crazy to me.
What?
Sounds kind of crazy to me.
I think he was hopeful in that,
Hopeful?
hopeful in that the word, when Diana was reading verse 5, he says, and he was telling the people, we will be back to see you. He was anticipating that, I think, that God was gonna do something.
He was doing what his neighbors did. It was the norm for a
It
holy
was the
person
norm.
to do that.
How would you describe Isaac?
Trusting.
Trusting?
Wide-eyed.
Wide-eyed.
Well, he didn't seem afraid, or he couldn't have wrapped him.
Yeah,
As a kid, he could have run away, but
And it seems to me here, you almost have Isaac's trust in his father mirrors Abraham's trust in God. And N.T. Wright suggests that this episode gets Abraham back on track after the banishment of Hagar and Ishmael. In other words, he's faced with a moral challenge after this sort of what he calls the murky morality of Ishmael, this banishment. But some of this, some of the commentaries treat this passage as a test of faith. In fact, the word test is used in it. And the problem is, I guess, why would God, who knows everything, put Abraham through this if he knew how Abraham would react in the first place? This is a God that has demonstrated through what he's done, that he is a God that wants to be in a relationship. He's a God that wants to love. It's a hard question. Which is what makes this so hard, but there are a couple of other things that we can talk about here. This one, if you look at verse 2, someone read verse 2 again.
Can I go back to your question? You said, why would God do this if he knew how Abraham would react in the first place? Isn't it in order to teach Abraham, to strengthen Abraham teach him that if he trusts God, it's the right thing to do,
I think in a sense, the question through all of this is, how deep is, Hagar and Abraham are finding out just how deep their trust in God is. So, and that's, it's not so much, well, let's read 2 and 12.
Is the question back here?
Oh, yes.
Well, I'm getting an idea, and I don't know, it's all about what God is presenting in the details of the story. But it also, with what you said, with Abraham having to banish Ishmael, why would he let Isaac live? I mean, he loved them both. And so there's a sense in which, with the culture of his time, that maybe Abraham was building this up and God stopped it. You know,
Well, of course, another take on the story, and you know, this is what occurred to me, sort of, is that Abraham misunderstood what God was wanting. Out of his own guilt over Ishmael, that he decided, well, I've got to go sacrifice this son if I gave up this son. And, you know, he would not be the first person who misunderstood what God was after. So, and it's interesting that usually these all involve hurting innocence. You know, and what we see with God is he doesn't want innocence hurt. He doesn't want the
I've heard several
helpless.
times too, that this, picking up on the rich young ruler in the New Testament, that basically God wanted to know what Abraham loved most. He was willing to give up for God's love. And I think that comes in real strong in our own lives. What do we put in front of God? It may just be one thing, but if there's something there, and that's the one thing he wants us to give up.
And I think, well, in 2, he talks about take your son. But look at verse 12. You have not withheld. Now I know. Now this is tough if you feel, for those of us who have sort of been raised to believe that God knows everything, you know. But remember, God is building a new relationship here. And so, this really, another way to look at it is God wanted to know, how deep is your faith? And that leads to the idea that one expert says in the Hebrew commentary, in the Hebrew Bible, that he's not testing Abraham so much as he is leading Abraham to understand just how much Abraham trusts God. Does that make sense? That sometimes it's not God who needs to know, we need to know. I need to know how much I trust
Because
God.
he already knows. He already knows.
Yeah, if he knows, but you know, that there is that one verse here that says God wanted to know. So that's 12. I know. Now I know. But I don't think we have to get so much bogged down in that as we need to know how deep our trust is. And when we are faced with situations, if you remember the scripture, God's response when he hears the voice of God is, "Here I am." That's all he says. Now, when Isaac calls to him, he says, "Here I am." The God will provide, you know, and so and he doesn't. The thing about it is, he doesn't argue. He doesn't bargain. He doesn't cry. He just says, "Here I am." And he prepares to do what he believes God has told him to do.
Isn't it, I was thinking of a teaching moment, or not more than a moment. That is, if a student is doing an experiment in chemistry class or something, and the professor already knows what it does, how it's gonna come out. But the student has to go through that, or they will not understand.
But I have to say, as a teacher, I had to know, when I asked my students to do an assignment, I had to know if they could do it. They had to do it in order for me to know. And I'm not, that's stretching it a little bit, but you understand. But I think here, really, the key here is, how much does Abraham trust God? How deep is his faith? And he certainly sees it here. Now, central in this is verse 8, where he says, God will provide. He even ends up naming the mountain, God will provide. It also can kind of be translated as God will see, or God will see to it. Okay? But he doesn't really give any details of how God's going to do this. He just says God will provide. And this interesting thing here is this passage ends with God swearing by God. He swears by himself that he will keep the promise. And verse 17 is problematic because it talks about taking possession of the city gates, that the followers of Abraham's people will take possession of the city gates of their enemies. But it also says, and through the Jews bless all nations. There's some of the commentary suggests that this does not mean military power. That when you went to the gates, in Jewish tradition, it was to discuss. You know, it's like, that's where they gathered. You know, you remember Paul, and it was true in Greek society, they had these places where people, you've been to London, is it Hyde Park, where they all gather to argue? That the idea here is the gates were really a reference to those discussions that took place in the city squares, so that people would be drawn into God's circle by what the Jews were saying. The Hebrew Bible calls this passage the Akedah. It's sort of the ultimate trial of faith. The word Akedah means to bind. The binding of Isaac is symbolic of the final binding of Abraham to God. This episode brings Abraham's spiritual odyssey to a close. He's there. He gets it. He's going to be able to move forward so that God's promises can work their way through the nation of Israel. He knows the depth of his faith after this episode, just how far he's willing to go. And one of the words that didn't come up is humility. Abraham exhibits an incredible amount of humility, especially in this last passage. And I think that's not always a word we associate sometimes with the Old Testament patriarchs, but those who truly responded to God tended to demonstrate humility. So today we started with the question in the first section, verse 14 and in chapter 18. Is anything impossible for the Lord? Is anything too wonderful for the Lord, depending on the translations? And we end with chapter 22, God will provide. So we sort of bookend this lesson with those questions. Do we trust God to provide? Regardless of whether or not we understand. How deep is our trust? It's always easy to trust when things work. And these passages, I'm going to wrap this up in 1 minute, Dennis, show a growing consciousness of the presence of God. Hagar and Abraham particularly Sarah, not so much, but